any idea, just in terms of how the heck do you move a cemetery? Do you move every single body? Just from what you've heard, like.
Right. So from what I understand, I think the standard procedure, because what happened in D.C. I think it was in 1858, maybe that there was a law that that there could be no cemeteries located south of Florida Avenue. So like which is the boundary of the old city of Washington. So a lot of cemeteries had to move at that time. This one actually moved a bit earlier, I think just because I think they were running out of space, but it kind of coincided with the same time that they had to move. Anyway, in most cases, I think the standard procedure was that you would reinter each person. But in this case, the district issued a permit, like a blanket permit for the whole thing. So there was not a requirement for like a separate permit for each reinterment as there otherwise would have been. So the agreement was that all of the people who were buried here were to be reinterred at the New Harmony Cemetery in Prince George's County, but it's become clear from what people witnessed later, and even a recent survey that was done here, that a lot of those coffins were not actually moved out of here. And then many people witnessed at the time, well, there were a couple times, one when the Metro was being built. So Metro, the very first DC Metro station was, Metro opened here between Rhode Island Avenue, I think, and Farragut North, the Red Line. So people who kind of live in the area and witnessed the Metro construction, and then some other construction that was being done later in the 80s, I think during both of those periods, there were human remains were unearthed, and like coffin remains, and people witnessed, well, I remember there's a quote in the newspaper of somebody saying they were putting bones in boxes the size of tissue boxes. So there were not, I think a lot of the people that were reinterred from this place were not, I'll just say they all ended up in like a mass grave at New Harmony with one section dedicated to the people that had been here, but they were not individually reinterred or individually named even once they, were reinterred there.
And what happened to the stones that were here for 38,000 people?
So the stones, there was no requirement. The agreement that was made did not require the stones to be moved or preserved, and so the man that bought this site, Lewis Bell, apparently put an ad in the paper making the stones available, I think for free, for anybody that might want them for riprap, which is like what I guess the kind of stones you use for erosion control. And so somebody, I think, came and got them and hauled them off to a site where they have recently been discovered along the Potomac River in Virginia.
It's really a really blatant destruction of these memories of all these people. Is this something that you've heard happening more than once to historic black cemeteries?
Oh yeah.
Just from what you've
Certainly, and certainly there's many cases throughout the country, yes, it happened all over the place. Here in DC, there was another very large black cemetery called Payne Cemetery. Also, reportedly 36,000 people were buried there. That cemetery was also purchased by Lewis Bell and later sold to the city for an elementary school. So an elementary school was actually built on top of that site. I don't know that I think at the time that the school was built, there was some recognition that it had been there. But there's other cemeteries in the city that have been developed over, there's sort of no recognition today that they ever even were there at all. Yeah.
And just the significance of this area, what was this area before, the cemetery was removed, and was the area changing, and is that one of the reasons this was allowed to happen?
I think, yeah, I think this area was becoming more attractive for development. and we actually documented the development of racially restricted housing in this around where the cemetery was at the time. I think around, well, I guess it would be before it left here, because nobody really did that after the Supreme Court made it unconstitutional to enforce racial covenants. That was in 1948. So before that, so as the cemetery was here in a place, it was a black cemetery in a place that was becoming a white restricted neighborhood. Yeah, which you wouldn't know that at all now, because it's not, yeah, but. And then, of course, the metro planning began in the 1960s. Oh, sorry. Are you okay? Okay. So metro planning began in the 1960s, and Lewis Bell, who had purchased the cemetery, then sold it for $3.5 million to the city, for the metro construction.
So it seemed as if Lewis Bell, in terms of the larger arc of this story, certainly made a business of buying and kind of unloading these cemeteries. Is that what was happening?
I mean, at least in a couple cases, yeah. I mean, I know that. I mean, from what yes. So yes, at least in the case of this cemetery and Payne Cemetery, there's another one he actually purchased too, called Woodlawn, also a very significant historic black cemetery. That one apparently he wasn't able to sell, and so he ended up selling. 10 years later, he sold it back to some people at a cemetery association that was interested in trying to maintain it.
So so I went to Woodlawn, and this situation where it was locked up. It was completely overgrown. It's just this massive, big space, big hills, but it's basically just grass this high, and it looked as if stones from a lot of our cemeteries have been brought there, and were just in piles and dumped there.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So it was kind of a bittersweet thing. It was like, okay, it's great that this is still here for the community, but it's also sad that it's completely in disarray. You can't even go inside, and no one's even cutting the grass. So I think it's, once again, we're kind of in that weird situation of, something's being preserved, but it's also in a dire,
Right. There's no resource dedicated to actually preserving it. And that's actually the case with one of the most historic black cemeteries in the district, which is in Rock Creek Park. It's called the Mount Zion Female Union Band Cemetery, and it was connected to the old Mount Zion Church in Georgetown and this mutual aid society, the Female Union Band Society. And that one also was sold, I think it was on the brink of being sold to a developer, and actually all of the stones were pulled out and piled up, and they're still like that. But there is a very, an effort now. That site has actually been, on the National Register for quite a while, and is gaining more attention through the advocacy of Lisa Fager, who's been just
I went to that
working
one.
hard there.
It was such an amazing, small, kind of on that little hilltop. Yeah. Anything else you'd like to say just about this, about Columbia Harmony, about the stones being in the river, about the stones being pulled out of the river? Anything about that kind of larger?
Yeah, I mean, I was astounded to learn that a site this significant is so little known in sort of the history of DC, and that's I mean, it was there were so many people buried here. There's so many really prominent people, but just so many people that almost everybody, if you are a black resident of the city that is, has been here whose family has been here for generations, you undoubtedly are connected to people that were buried at this place. But most people have no idea. So I think, I would hope that there would be, and there's a lot of people don't know whatever happened. A lot of people don't know. They do know their relatives are buried here, but don't know what happened to them.
Before we end, any really unusual stories you heard about, people who,
I mean, not unusual stories. I just have like a couple little stories. Like I know there's a very famous black leader named Mary Church Terrell who was active throughout the 20th century in DC, and like maybe most famously in her 80s led a campaign to desegregate downtown stores and restaurants and theaters. And she actually, her husband, Robert Terrell, was DC's first black judge. He was buried here. She is an example of somebody who actually had her husband reinterred to another place. And I guess there were other people that had the means, that probably had the means to do that. There's another story, though, of Duke Ellington, who, Washington really embraces him, but his parents were also buried here, and he had left. I think he lived in New York by this time and got the notice that, he had some very limited amount of time to get him out of here if he didn't want them bulldozed. And his biographer has written that he said that he felt like the city disinherited him at that time.
Did he move them?
I don't know. I don't know what happened. Yeah.
So many, with
Yeah.
38,000 lives, you're going to have 30 more stories. Everyone is a story.
Yeah.